Now it's perfect, and our attendees are here, and we can get
Oh,
started.
I'll start with a couple of smaller items, and then we'll go on to the sort of the main topic for today. I read an interesting article in which it said that the 10 richest people all doubled their wealth on average since the beginning of COVID, which was, say, March 2020. And it in a certain way goes against what logic is, which is that so many people have suffered economically because of COVID. But the 10 richest people in the world, out of 10 of them, they're all men. Out of 10 of them, 9 are US residents. One is French. Their collective wealth went from so these are 10 people, remember. So these 10 people together owned $700 billion before COVID, and they now own $1.5 trillion as of, say, the beginning of the month. I suppose, I'm not sure when the cutoff date is, but it was maybe a week ago or so. All of these people, almost all of them, are in some sort of high-tech field. And their names, of course, are probably very familiar to you, which are Bill Gates and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, Sergey Brin, Warren Buffett, Larry Ellison, Larry Page, Steve Ballmer, and Bernard Arnault, and Mark Zuckerberg. So these are all of them. Maybe the only one that you've never heard of, possibly, is this Bernard Arnault, who's the only non-American. He's French, and he owns the Louis Vuitton sort of group of companies. At the same time as these people doubled their wealth, 160 million more people fell into poverty. Poverty is defined as making less than $5.50 a day. Women and minorities were the most heavily affected because of job losses arising from COVID. So that means, all the tourism going down, all the restaurants going down, everything associated with travel going down, hotels, etc. For these poor people, inflation, which has taken hold now pretty well everywhere around the world, some countries more, some less. But if you have no income, inflation makes matters much, much worse. The sort of, let's not call it solution, but let's call it the changes that some people were asking for, including some of the Democratic members of the Senate, including Bernie Sanders, was to have some sort of a tax on capital or tax on wealth, whereby, as most taxation systems work these days, you're taxing income. But these people, taxing income is not that efficient, and it still leaves this huge gap between people who have a lot and people who have nothing. Tax on wealth would be even harder to do because wealth can be shifted around, can be classified in different ways, and it's just a fact of life and a fact of our economy that the situation is as it is. Many people, including Bill Gates, have asked that a taxation system be changed because they pay so little tax compared to the amount that they have. Anyway, it was just an interesting article to read about, showing how much these people have had their wealth increase. Now, of course, one of the explanations is that at the beginning of COVID, the stock markets were all very far down, and now they've come back up. So, that explains for part of it. Anyway, just put that in the background. One of the most impressive events of this week was this volcanic eruption in Tonga. And I'm sure all of you have seen the sort of replay of the actual eruption taken from a satellite. It was just unbelievable. Tonga is in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific Ocean, some 1,800 kilometers from New Zealand. So it's kind of really a very isolated group of islands. And one of them, what seems to have happened is that there was a volcano on the island, and the land actually sunk and the volcano kind of went underwater. And then 2 days later, it erupted. And when the hot magma hit the cold water, there was this enormous explosion. And, that's what we saw on the video. The sound of this explosion was heard 4,000 kilometers away. So, for example, imagine something in people in Montreal hearing an explosion in Calgary. That's pretty, give you an idea of how far away this explosion was. The waves that resulted from the tsunami that was generated hit California, they hit Alaska, they caused damage in Peru, and completely on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. And of course, the damage to Tonga itself is still unmeasured, but pretty well the whole country is covered in ash from this volcano. The Pacific, is known as the Rim of Fire, and Tonga happens to be sitting on a boundary between two plates in the Pacific Ocean, and that explains the generation of all this heat coming from one plate rubbing against another, and then the heat is forced up through a volcano, and then what happened, of course, blew up. Just to give you some little bit of information on this kind of mostly forgotten place, it's a country which has only 100,000 people living in it at this moment. There are 169 islands in Tonga, of which 36 are inhabited, but one of the islands contains 70% of all the people in the country. And the volcano blew up very close, not on that island, but on another one that was pretty close to that one. People only came to live there some 1500, around 1500 BC. So somewhere around 3,000 years ago to 2,500 years ago is when people first arrived there on that island. So historically speaking, then, in terms of human evolution, it's really been only very recently that people came to live there, spreading from other islands in the Pacific. It was only in the 1600s that they had the first European contact, and these were people who were whalers looking for whales, and they visited the island. In 1900, Great Britain took over the sort of administration or ownership of the island. But unlike in other places, Tonga was always independent, and they had a royal family that stayed ruling that country the whole time when Britain was in charge of it. So unlike in other places, like say Hawaii, where the king was deposed, Great Britain allowed the monarchy to continue, even though Great Britain, of course, sort of had their own monarch, of course. They became independent in 1970, and it was really the only Pacific country to be continuously independent, throughout the whole colonial period. They have no real resources except for all of the sea area that they control. They tried making money by selling passports, by advertising themselves as a nuclear waste dump, by registering ships, issuing stamps, the usual sort of things that islands with no resources can do. The agriculture and fishing on the on the islands are just for local, consumption. They're so far away from anywhere else that it would be hard to ship any kind of, agricultural goods, abroad. Maybe for every one Tongan who lives in Tonga, two of them live abroad. So people have chosen to move away in order to make a living for themselves, moving to, say, Australia, New Zealand, or the US. And they send money home. So they have very close ties to their home country, but they live abroad and send money to their families. And that's how most people in Tonga are managing to make a living. The country, though, is ruled by this royal family, which is considered extremely corrupt. They were rated the sixth most corrupt country in 2008. And the country is also known because of the amount of overweight people in Tonga. They consider being fat is a sign of beauty. And so a lot of people in that country are huge in their size. That's about it. Some cruise ships have come there once in a while to look at whales, and they grow a little bit of vanilla, which is a sort of a cash crop. But overall, it's a kind of a has so few people and is so kind of unimportant that in a certain way the world has forgotten about that country up until now. Even the Chinese, who are busy exploring all Pacific countries and trying to help them, they haven't really put their eyes on Tonga yet, up until now. It's sort of Australia and New Zealand are like their big brother, and they're the ones who are, in a certain sense, responsible for that country. So, that's about the tsunami, and it goes to the volcanic explosion, and it goes to show how environmental issues can really affect the whole world, because this explosion in the middle of nowhere caused considerable damage, although no deaths, in many Pacific countries, and even in the waves came ashore even in Santa Cruz, California. So it really does show how sort of something happens in one place can affect somewhere else. It's a reminder of the 2002 volcanic eruption in Indonesia, if you recall, which led to that enormous tsunami that killed hundreds of thousands of people in the entire Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean areas. So this was much less severe, and it was located much farther from populated areas, so that's why the damage was so much less. Okay, leaving that aside, we'll come to this sort of topic of the day, which I looked at the fact that yesterday was Martin Luther King Day in the United States. And I thought I would talk a little bit in detail about the ways that the American government is trying to honor Mr. King by passing this change in the Voting Act, and how much trouble they've had passing it. So, before we just get into that, you will notice that in the United States, people are now saying that Mr. Biden is a very weak leader, and that he can't get things done, and that the country seems to be kind of drifting. Inflation is taking hold. Challenges being pushed at the US from the outside world, like from Russia or from China, are not being answered. And the popularity of Mr. Biden has fallen into the low 40%. range, which means that elections which are going to be held this November will most likely result in the Republicans taking over one or both of the houses of Congress in the US. What Mr. Biden has tried to do, among other things, is to pass something called the Voting Rights Act. And part of the incentive for doing this is to protect and support the Black community in the US, which is being honored by Martin Luther King Day, and which has been threatened by changes taking place in different states as voting laws passed since the 2020 election. In general, there's so much that could be said about the US Black community, but it's one of the interesting demographic parts of it is that although they are growing faster than the white population in the US, they're growing much slower than some of the other communities like the Latino community and the Asian community in the US. Other interesting facts is that the Black people in the US are leaving the major cities that they once sort of controlled. Cities like Washington, DC, and Detroit, and Chicago, and Baltimore are cities where the percentage of Blacks has gone down quite significantly in the last, since the last census was taken. So part of this whole voting issue has to do with the census of 2020. You might remember that the news has just come out that the ex-President Trump was trying very hard to get the census takers to separate out non-citizens from citizens when counting up the people in the US. The reason for this is that what Mr. Trump wanted was that non-citizens not be counted, and therefore when the statistics are all taken together, the allotment of seats in the US Congress is changed every 10 years according to what the census says. And if you don't count non-citizens, then states that have a lot of non-citizens lose representation, and that's what he wanted. The census takers refused to do this for both ideological and practical reasons. The Constitution of the United States does not say that the census has to eliminate non-citizens. They said that all people residing in the country should be counted. So it didn't say all citizens. Getting back to what I was saying before is that the Black population moving out of cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Washington do have a political effect on these cities and how they're run. And, many of these cities for the last maybe 20 odd years had Black mayors and Black city councilors. And when the census shows that the demographics have changed, it sort of means political fights as to who gets to sit on city council, in these various cities. So Blacks have left these cities because of deindustrialization, the closing of factories that attracted them to move there from the South in the first place. Like, for example, the stockyards in Chicago, factories and steel factories in Baltimore, the car factories in Detroit. All these places have closed down significantly, and so there's a movement either out to the suburbs by people who have sort of moved up the social ladder, or in many cases moving back to the south where they have families and where industry is expanding. Although industry which is paying a lot less money and are much less unionized than the ones that were in the north. So that's a kind of a demographic movement of what's happening in the Black population ever since probably, somewhere around the year 2000 or even before that. Washington, D.C., which was known as being a Black city, is today less than 50% Black. So it just tells you how, how demographics change. The Voting Rights Act was named after John Lewis, who was one of the associates of Martin Luther King, one of his very closest associates. And he was a member of Congress for some 30 odd years, representing the Georgia district, and who passed away recently. And so the idea of this Voting Rights Act was to try to expand voting rights and to guarantee voting rights and to solve the problems that have come up both in the recent past and before that. In 1965, when civil rights was at its kind of peak and many civil rights laws were passed, one of the laws that were passed said that states which had previously violated the rights of their citizens to vote would be under the supervision of the federal government if they wanted to change any voting laws. And this stipulation lasted from 1965 up until 2013. In 2013, the Supreme Court tossed out that kind of control that the federal government had over these states, saying it was discriminatory. And ever since then, these states, which are mainly southern states controlled by Republicans, have passed restrictive voting laws, which in one way or another disadvantaged the Black populations living in those states. So, among other things, this Voting Rights Act is there to try to correct that. Since many, of course, the vast majority of Black people vote for the Democratic Party, since these states are controlled by Republicans, they wanted to minimize, let's say, as much as possible, the Democratic votes. And so laws that they made were there to make it harder for Democratic voters to vote. The bill would reimpose oversight over any state which violates the 14th and 15th Amendment, which is the amendment to the Constitution that say that everyone has an equal right to vote. Any citizen has an equal right to vote. If these states were found to be discriminating against minorities on the basis of race or language or native populations, then the federal government would be able to come in and fix up, let's say, or invalidate the laws that these states have passed. So very controversial, obviously, this Voting Rights Act, and it's no question or no surprise that the Republicans would be so much against it. What I find a bit disturbing about this, like other ideas that the governments have had, is it sort of racializes or classifies or categorizes people and gives kind of different racial groups sort of different, in a way, not different rights, but different attention from the federal government. And one of my big objections to this is that to categorize people into racial groups is it's like trying to achieve something, by categorizing people on race instead of achieving the results by doing it in a more neutral way. Only South Africa gave people an identity based on their race. And nowadays, of course, who's to say who belongs to what race? And it's something that seems to obsess the US. And yet, my belief is that these things can be achieved without doing that sort of categorization. Anyway, that's an aside. The other issues that this Voting Rights Act wants to correct is the whole issue about gerrymandering. So gerrymandering is a political act of trying to draw districts to favor the party that's in power, that's doing the drawing. In Canada and everywhere else, as soon as you have a country divided where seats where seats are divided by district, well, the person who draws the district has some control over how those seats are won. Gerrymandering means an exaggerated or excessive amount of drawing to achieve certain political ends by drawing the boundaries of districts in such a way so that your voters are advantaged and your opposition voters are disadvantaged. It's named after a Massachusetts politician named Eldridge Gerry, who did this, way back in the late 1700s. So this sort of practice has been around for a long time. Even in Canada, on the provincial level or the federal level, there's always been complaining about how district boundaries are drawn, how riding boundaries are drawn, but these complaints are far less severe than what goes on in the US. What this bill does is it gives the federal government oversight on the district drawing boundaries which are blatantly political. Now, in the United States, some states have neutral commissions which draw their boundaries, something like Elections Canada will say in Canada. But other states, it's the state legislature itself which does the drawing. This is very important because every 10 years, the census comes up with a total number of people living in a certain state. And since the number of members of Congress does not increase or decrease, any changes in population of the states have to be reflected in the number of seats allocated in the members of Congress, members of the House of Representatives allocated by that census. So just to sort of repeat again, the Senate in the US is made up of 100 people, 2 from each state. So big states and small states get the same number of senators, which obviously advantages small states over big states. The members of the House of Representatives are allocated by population. So the rules are that every state gets at least 1 member of the House of Representatives, no matter what the population of that state is. But after that allocation of one member, all the other ones are allocated by population. So the biggest states have more members of the House of Representatives, and the smallest states have only 1. The way that the system works is that after the census is done, each state is allocated a number of members of the House of Representatives. Could be up, could be down, mostly it's the same. The faster growing states get an extra seat or 2, like Texas got this round, and the slow growing states lose 1, because of the changes in population. So in general, kind of the faster growing states in the Western US and Southern US gain seats, and the slower growing areas, especially the Midwest, like Michigan, West Virginia, lose seats and lose representation. But once the number is decided, let's say it's decided that Michigan will get 16 members, losing, let's say, 1 member, it's up to the state legislator to figure out where the boundaries are to draw up those 16 districts. And that's where gerrymandering comes into effect. Although it's always been done, it's computers which really assisted the legislators in power to decide how to divide the boundaries to the best advantage of their own party. And the Republicans have been much more aggressive in this area than the Democrats have been. Although the Democrats have also kind of used the boundary drawings to their advantage, since the Republicans control more states, it's always been them who've decided to really push hard on drawing boundaries to their own advantage. So how is this done? There's two ways to draw these boundaries in an unfair way. One is by dividing up, by first of all identifying who are your voters, and more importantly, who are the voters of the opposition. Now, since in the United States, the Black population is the most united voting group in their preferences, and since their preferences are always the Democratic Party, if you're the Republicans, what you want to do is minimize the Black vote as much as possible. And that's what they've done. So there's two ways of minimizing. One way is called packing, meaning finding where all the Blacks live in your state and trying to make a district that will include all of them, so that one district will be, let's say, Democratic, and then everywhere else, the Republicans have a much better chance of winning. This past week, there was an election in Florida for a member of Congress to replace one which had passed away, the so-called 20th district of Florida. And if you look at a map of this 20th district, it includes, this is in southern Florida, so it includes all the areas to the west of in the western part of Miami-Dade County, Broward County, and even going into Palm Beach County. Now, you would normally think that these counties would be kind of divided according to the county itself, but here what the Republicans have done is that the Black people living in those counties live in the western part of those counties, and so they drew a line from the south to the north that sort of incorporates all these Black areas and some other suburbs, leaving sort of leaving that district to be only 20% white and some 60% Black and 20% Latino. And so they've sort of, in a way, insulated the other areas from that heavily Black vote. And so that's an example of gerrymandering, which resulted in the expected victory of the Democratic candidate this time around. But it's in a sense unfair because geographically it takes parts of 3 different counties and put them in one district, rather than sort of, let's say, taking one county and making that one district all by itself. So packing, this is called packing. So you pack all your opponents into one area, leaving the other districts open to your own party's advantage. The other way to do it is dividing. So in some places, it's better to, let's say, for example, you have a place where, let's say a place where maybe Blacks will live in one concentrated area in a city. If you want to minimize their power, what you could do is take their district and take a little piece of each of the Black neighborhoods and put it in separate districts. And therefore, they lose the advantage of their sort of concentrated vote, and you sort of split them up among several different districts, which you hope the Democrats won't win any of them. So this is a dividing system, which is also used, and it's the strength of computers which will tell the ones doing the boundaries which is the best way for their party to do this. And this has been occurring, like I said, throughout American history, but ever since the computers have become used, starting in this, well, not starting in, but the power of them have led to gerrymandered votes in lots of different places. So I said some states, they don't use the system at all. The states which have only one representative in the very small populated states like Vermont or North Dakota or Wyoming, obviously gerrymandering is not an issue because the whole state is one district. But in states that have, bigger populations, it's possible to eke out an extra advantage in that way. So, for example, in some of the southern states, like say a state like Mississippi, which I think has 7 members of Congress, there's only 1 Democrat, even though the Black population of Mississippi is about 1/3 of the state. So this just gives you an idea about how that happens. So the Voting Rights Act is meant to counteract this and put in controls over extremely gerrymandered maps. Other thing it's trying to do is to have the government approve voter ID laws and to try to make it easier for people to vote. And the Republicans have passed laws to make it harder for people to vote. So, for example, many of the Republican states are using voter IDs to limit or restrict how easy it is to register to vote. So, for example, they won't approve student ID cards as voter ID, but they'll approve a gun registration ID as a voter ID, in addition to, of course, driver's licenses. Remember that in the US, they don't have the systems that we have where everyone gets issued a state ID like we have our Medicare cards where every single person gets one. There, they don't have any kind of statewide identification card. So everyone, if they want to register, they have to use various types of voter ID, some of which, let's say people who are very poor don't have a driver's license. And, therefore makes it much harder for them to register to vote. The government also wants people to be able to register to vote the same day as the election and to expand the places where people could register to vote. So another way to limit voter registration is just to put the registration offices in places where your opponents don't live. And these are all measures which the government is trying to correct. They want to also establish standards for early voting by mail. And the voter laws wants to make election day a day off, like a public holiday. So that way people who are working don't have to take away time from work to go out and vote. They want that if someone requests a mail-in ballot, that the post be prepaid, that the ballots will be sent out to anyone who asks for one, not requiring an excuse of why they need one. That the instructions, and here's an interesting one, that the instructions for the elections, when you ask for a mail-in ballot, that the instructions be bilingual in minority languages. So there's an interesting little detail. They want to have at least 2 weeks of advance voting. We have advance voting here. There's some parts of the US where there's no advance voting at all. and they want you to just show up on voting day and vote in person. And the way that you can make it harder for people to vote is not to have a lot of places where you can actually show up to vote, or to put the places where you have to show up to vote far away from the places where your opponents live. So all these tricks have been done, and the voting laws that are proposed are trying to get rid of those sort of tricks. You might recall that because of COVID during the 2020 election, many people wanted to vote by mail. Many people wanted to vote in advance, and these were things that were seized upon by the Republicans to say that the elections were unfair, were illegal, because so many people voted by mail and so many people voted in advance. Needless to say, there's nothing partisan about voting in advance or voting by mail. But the way the Republicans saw it, it was opening a door to fraud, because you didn't show up in person on voting day to vote. The other thing, of course, a major issue about voting in the US is to limit the role that money plays in determining who wins. So in the US, they have a kind of a system where anything goes, that huge amounts of money can be donated to political parties or candidates, or these political action committees can be set up to support a certain candidate or a certain policy. And we in Canada have very strict limits on how much people can donate to political parties, and corporations are not allowed to make donations, because obviously that would mean that they expect something in return. So the US doesn't have any of these sort of spending caps, and this new law is proposing that there be spending caps in order to limit the influence of money on elections. Unfortunately for Mr. Biden, he doesn't have enough. This bill was passed in the House of Representatives, but in the Senate, their chances of passing this bill are very low, because he at the very most has 50 supporters, a couple of which are not exactly happy about it. But you need 60 votes in the Senate in order to pass a bill, because of what's called a filibuster, which is a method that a minority party can use to stop a bill from passing. So in the US now, in order to overcome a filibuster, you need 60 votes, which of course the Democrats don't have in the American Senate. So what Biden wants to do is to end the filibuster rule, to end the rule that says that a minority of senators can block any kind of legislation. Now, there's some senators on the Democratic side, like Joe Manchin, who say, look, I support the voting rights bill, but I don't support ending the filibuster, because the filibuster was a technique, or was a system used to make sure that votes in the Senate would be somewhat bipartisan. That, in other words, you need to have some senators from the opposite party voting with you in order to pass a bill, in order to make sure that this is not a strictly party line vote. It's less divisive that way. And there is a certain logic to it, except that in the past, the Republicans have decided that they don't want to support anything, for example, that President Obama was proposing. And this sort of hard line was developed by one of their former leaders, Newt Gingrich, who said, politics is war, and we have to do everything we can to win. Whereas, in the 20th century, there was a lot of bipartisanship and a lot of the parties working across party lines. Mr. Biden managed to pass sort of a COVID aid package in a bipartisan way. He also passed this huge infrastructure bill, $2 trillion worth, to fix up America's infrastructure. But the other initiatives that he wanted to take, which is, to change the tax system, to allow free, expand Medicare, to making it a system like ours, to have early childhood education, to tax people in a more fair way. None of these things could be passed because there's no support for this by the opposition party. And what he said is that that the majority of people did elect the Democrats, that the Democratic senators, who are 50 of them, represent far more people than the 50 Republican senators, and therefore it's undemocratic to allow a minority to block the will of the majority. But because of the existing rules, he won't be able to pass this all these voting changes. And so it's just another kind of indication of how weak, in a way, his government is. I mean, when you only get half the Senate seats, what can you expect? That's what I would say. When we coming back to voting, let me just check my watch. Coming back to the voting system in the U.S., the federal system, we have to understand that their system is so different from ours. In that, in the United States, it's the states themselves who control the voting process in the federal elections. So in other words, you have 50 states in the US, and each state runs their own federal election, unlike what we have here in Canada, where it's Elections Canada, a federal body, which runs the federal elections. There, it's the states themselves which set the rules, and each state's rules are a little bit different, which certify the rules, certify the counting of the ballots, which report the results to the people, to the TV networks and the media, which register the results with the federal government, and ultimately which choose the electors who go to Washington after the election to choose the president. And this is where all the hullabaloo started last time, because President Trump felt that he really didn't lose the close states, and he asked the Republican governors of those states to throw out the election results and to choose a different slate of electors for the Electoral College. And when there's a dispute in the Electoral College, then the results of that state are thrown out. And then the House of Representatives itself chooses the president. And each state has one vote. And since there are more Republican states, President Trump wanted the election to be carried out in that way. So the Democrats, of course, want to reform this system, which is very kind of archaic and very convoluted and very open to manipulation. I mean, suppose in the last election, the Republican states did get their secretaries of state to throw out the election results and to say, well, because the election was not held fairly, we're going to name our own slate of electors. Then, it could have happened, and then all hell would break loose as far as deciding who won the election. So that's why they would love to change this system. But because the system is set that way in the Constitution, that the states run the elections, there's not much hope of changing the Constitution. The Republicans are saying that the voting laws, the voting bill that is being proposed is something which goes against the Constitution, which is to give the federal government control or influence over what the state's job should be. And the federal elections in the US are carried out by the states and not by the federal government. The Democrats, in a sense, want to make it easier to vote for everybody. The Republicans want to emphasize prevention of fraud, of which there was no fraud in the last time, but they have the right to change the laws as they want. Each state does, and that's what they're doing. The other thing is that the elections in the US are different from our elections in that they choose many different candidates at the same time. So they're voting on a federal level, they're voting on a state level, they're voting even on a local level. And so the ballots are long, and the time it takes to vote is a long time if you have to choose every candidate that you have. It's easy, therefore, to use this complicated election system to make it either easier or harder to vote. And if the polls are not placed in the right places, if the hours that are decided when the polls are open are kind of manipulated, these restrictions can lead to difficulty in voting. You might have seen pictures of people waiting hours and hours and hours to vote in the US. Some of them waited for 2 hours and more to be able to vote. And, of course, our system here, you're in and out pretty quickly. And that's why, the Biden administration wants to expand mail balloting, expand early voting, to restrict the way that polls can be decided on where they should be placed. You might have heard that this silly law that some Republican states passed saying you're not allowed to give water to people who are standing in line. So, because that might influence their vote. That's where all of this sort of fighting is taking place on this kind of very practical level. Just to sum up, then it looks like this Voting Rights Act won't be passed, and it's the kind of, I would say, neglect of the Democratic Party in state elections going back many years, which have allowed the Republicans to take control of the states, and that allows them to set the laws for the federal election system. We're lucky in Canada that we don't have these sort of very partisan election rules that Election Canada and the Election Quebec, election officials in all the other provinces have a neutral body which controls the elections and which limits spending on political campaigns and tries to make a bit of a more democratic system than what they have in the US. But remember that because our elections are held in different times in the states, in the provinces, and in the federal government, and because you're only voting for one candidate at a time, your time spent in line is very short. You're in and out quickly, and it sort of simplifies things in terms of counting the votes. And, so our systems are different, so the results end up being so different. Anyway, that's just a bit of a summary about this proposal to change the voting rights. I'm going to see now if you have any questions about this. or about other subjects that you might want to hear about. I haven't spoken this time about COVID because I don't want to do that every time, but maybe because it looks as if there's finally some breaking in this epidemic, maybe we'll have some numbers to talk about next week. The other event that people have been paying so much attention to is this attack on the synagogue in Fort Worth, Texas, where 4 people were taken hostage, and in the end, the hostage taker was killed, and the 4 hostages escaped. Certainly, for those people who feel that anti-Semitism is not a big issue, it just reinforces again the vulnerability of the small Jewish population, in places outside of Israel, and how vulnerable this community is to people who don't like it. It's something which at least has sort of concentrated people's attention and brought back the notion that, yes, this particular community is so very vulnerable. So anyway, yeah, if you've got any comments about this or questions about this, just let me know.
We are now waiting for questions.
Okay, good enough. Good enough. I know that Montreal has had a snowstorm, but sort of, I would say, what Schadenfreude is. I mean, feeling sort of when a disaster happens to somebody else and you feel happy about it. That's what that word means. And Toronto really got bombed this past week. They got 40 centimeters in a city which is completely ill-equipped to handle it. And the city is like frozen now for the 2nd day in a row. So, where our streets are already being cleared off and life is beginning to get back to normal. Their big expressway, the Gardner and the Don Valley, were completely closed because of the snowstorm. But, winter is winter, and climate change and global warming notwithstanding, it's still winter, and we could still get a big storm like that.
We've got a hand up from Steve. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, hi Hershey.
Yeah, hi, Steve.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you well. Thank you so much for tuning in, and what do you have to ask?
Okay, thank you. Well, I have comments more than questions, really.
Okay, sure.
You had mentioned that 2 senators from each state disadvantages larger states, but
Yeah.
I would say that 2 senators from each state was instituted to not disadvantage the smaller states over the more populated larger states. Were this not done or not agreed to, there never would have ever been a United States of America at the time of its founding.
That is true. That's exactly true.
Okay.
The discussions to form a union when the 13 colonies were discussing making a country, the fear was that if everything was just allocated according to population, that the 2 largest states in population, 2 or 3 largest states, which would be in those days Virginia, New York, and Massachusetts, and also maybe Pennsylvania, that the smaller states would not have any say whatsoever. And so they instituted this idea of having a kind of a 2-body Congress, where one would be by population and one would be fixed 2 senators per state. The other way that this plays to the advantage of the small states is in determining the electoral college. The electoral college is something where you take the number of senators and you add those to the number of representatives, and that equals the number of electoral college votes each state has. So obviously, the fact that you start off with 2 per state advantages the smaller states.
I was going to mention that in with regards to the electoral college, because without 2 senators from each state, without the electoral college, the American elections would always be decided by cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, with no need to even visit any of these smaller states. So the electoral college ensures that there'll be a fairer election, and all states will be considered.
Well, it's not fairer in the sense that different people's votes count for more or less. So it disadvantages states that have larger populations and advantages states that have smaller populations. So the voters, the individual voters in the smaller states have more say than in the larger states. So in that way, it's not, depending on what you want to call fair, it's not one man, one vote. It's
Right.
one man, one vote, but each vote counts differently, let's say.
Well, I would say that that as it was founded, that it is fair, because America is not a pure democracy. It's a republic and a representative democracy.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. It goes exactly with how the founders, the bargain. It was a bargain. And, you know, when you have conditions that are made in a bargain, you know, things don't always end up in that way. I mean, in Canada, we have a kind of a shadow of that, in that, let's say Prince Edward Island, whose population is 130,000, they have 4 federal seats. Well, 130,000 divided by 4 is like 35,000. But the average size of a federal seat in the rest of Canada is around 100,000. So, you know, we do have those inequalities in a very minor way also.
Also, Hershey, I wanted to make a comment regarding Republicans making it harder for people to vote. I would say that the Republicans want to make it harder for non-citizens to vote. They don't want to take the vote away from legitimate citizens.
You know, there's been very extensive research done, of course, in the last election, and there's almost no incidences of fraud of, let's say, somebody voting twice or somebody taking someone else's name to vote. And the tiny few cases that they found were all, you know, Republicans who are sort of trying to cheat the system.
And Hershey, can you actually believe that? Can you believe that, with vote harvesting, dead people on the rolls, people moving from one state to another without notifying that they've moved? You had said that that there was no fraud in the last election. That statement is highly unlikely. There were 17 states.
Think of it. Think of all the work that's been done, and there haven't been any. You know, there hasn't been any public, you know, cases being brought where these fraud things happened. I mean,
Hershey.
Yes, it is true. People move from state to state, and they may not you know, they may vote in the new state that they moved to without taking their names off the roll of the old state. But that doesn't mean that they've done anything wrong, because they're not going to run from one state to the other on election day to vote twice. There isn't any sort of indication that that ever happened. And as far as what you would call vote harvesting, which is such a nasty term, all that simply means is that where you had an ability to drop off your ballot in a sealed envelope, if somebody goes and, let's say, goes to a place a community center, let's say like, I don't know, let's say the JCC or something like that, where people have gathered, they said, okay, look, one person can pick up everybody's ballot in a sealed envelope and drop them all off into a mailbox or into a ballot box itself. There's no reason why that should be fraudulent any more than somebody walking on their own to go drop their ballot in a box. There's no indication that there's anything fraudulent about that. Or let's put it like this: there hasn't been any proof shown that there was any fraud of that sort in the last election.
Okay, in this last election, with regards to the integrity of the election, 17 states petitioned the Supreme Court to hear their challenges of the election process, but the Supreme Court, which has primary jurisdiction in disputes between states, because there is no other court that can hear a challenge of one state to another. The Supreme Court refused to hear these challenges. It's not like that they were heard and it was decided that there was no merit to it.
Well,
it was
but
decided
think
not
of
to
it,
hear
think
that.
of
But
the
just if I could just,
Republican-
Hershey, if I
Yeah.
could just continue for a moment.
Okay,
What
go ahead.
What is this here opposition by the Democrat Party to fair elections with voter ID, with photo ID? The only reason I can think of is because the Democrats want to cheat. If the Democrats didn't want to cheat, why would the southern border be open? If it were if it were Republicans coming over the southern border into the United States, I'm sure that the rest of that wall would have already been constructed. This is part of the reason why the
Well,
Democrats don't want to see.
right. I would say the simple solution, I mean, this is a super simple solution, is for all states to issue ID cards like we have. But the Republican states don't want to do that. They don't want to issue a card to everybody because, personal freedoms. And why should I have to carry around the card to prove who I am? So they're the ones who've been opposing this historically.
I'm not so sure that the Republicans are opposed to that. I think that the
They are.
Republicans.
No, absolutely they are. Absolutely.
Well, you can send me a link. I could read it.
But what I wanted to say was that the Republican states in the close ones all wanted so-called audits to be done on the votes, and as you know very well, all these audits went nowhere because they couldn't prove any kind of fraud. Especially the one in Arizona. The one in Arizona, they were looking for bamboo ballots and who knows what else. If they found anything, they would have been publicized, and they never did.
You had a media that is totally in lockstep with the Democrat Party. I'll leave it at that.
I don't. For sure, there's media who are, pro-Democrat and media that are pro-Republican. Just as, all around the world, you've got media in England or in France, which are, associated with one sort of party or another. I think that's pretty well inevitable, but it doesn't mean that, or let me put it to you like this, that it seems as if in the United States, they've raised, the partisan division is so strong and has been pushed even stronger by different media, that it turns out that people don't believe anything that the opposite media says. We have the National Post and the Globe and Mail in Canada, and no one is going to say, well, anything you read in the Globe and Mail is a lie, and vice versa. So it's the division of the state of the United States, which is a cause of all of these disputes, which has led to the fact that 75% of Republicans feel that Biden didn't win the election. even though there hasn't been any kind of evidence that that's the case. So that's how strong the division is in the US. And it's unfortunate because it blocks, as I was saying last week, it blocks the US from acting together on any issue, because the legitimacy of the government is in question.
Also, the last thing that I'll just mention is that with regards to the filibuster, I think that both parties have wanted to change the rules from one way to the other, depending
For sure.
upon who's in power and whose ox is being gored.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're absolutely right that if Biden succeeded in getting rid of it, the moment that the Republicans would get into office, which of course is very possible, then the Democrats would have wanted to have a way to block unilateral action by that side.
Yeah.
We don't have that. I mean, in Canada, we have a clear understanding that the party that wins an election has the right to pretty well do whatever they want.
Yeah.
And that there isn't this sort of blockage that could be carried out to stop the will of the majority party. That's just part of the British parliamentary system. It works that way. But the US, because of division of powers in the US, and because of distrust of government that was put in to the US Constitution from the very beginning by dividing powers and checks and balances, they've always tried to sort of engineer a way that there can't be what we would call the tyranny of the majority. And in our system, it was decided that the government in power stays in power, does whatever they want for 4 years, and then if you don't like it, vote against them the next time.
Hershey, I'll just leave you with one last thing that maybe perhaps at some point you could give us a talk on executive privileges and the consequences of disallowing that with regards to Mark Meadows testifying before a House committee, and how that would violate executive privilege, not only for Donald Trump, but all future presidents going forward, and what that would mean.
It's a good subject, but it's very, what am I looking for? It's very specific.
Okay.
And somewhere I'll have to try to figure out, the next time we talk about American politics, or if something like this, if something comes up as far as these different procedures that are taking place, or in other words, if maybe this January 6th committee comes up with some recommendations, that might be a time to discuss something like that.
Thanks very much.
It's so nice to hear your voice again, and it's such a strange way to communicate over this little box over here. Rather than seeing people in person. I'm hoping that maybe by spring things might change, and this huge wave, because it comes in so strong, it should fall down just as strongly, and then maybe we can get back to normal in the spring or summer. But anyway, thanks again, Steve. It's always a pleasure to hear you, and your thoughts are well formulated, and it's